I'll be showing you how I built these acoustic panels at home, which I'll be using for my small home theater room. I built a few different versions before I settled on this design here, and I'll go into more details throughout the video about things I learned and methods that seem to work better than others. I will also include all materials I used and links to them down in the description below if you're interested. Let's get right into it. So I used a 3/4 inch birch plywood for the acoustic panel frame because it's already perfectly straight, smooth, strong, and unlike solid wood, won't warp over time with changes in humidity levels. The frame I decided to go with actually consists of two separate parts, which has two reasons as to why that is. First, it makes the frame much stronger than if you just used a frame similar in design to this right here, since when it comes to wrapping the fabric over the frame, you will slightly stretch it on tight, which will bow the frame inwards towards the center of the frame. But this design here, it makes it much stronger and prevents that bowing from happening. Second, I wanted to have an oak wood frame around the whole panel, and the second section of the plywood allows me to install that oak border flush with the fabric. The plywood that makes the face of the panel frame, I decided to go with a beveled look, which was a personal preference, but could be left with a square finish as well. Next, we move on to gluing both these parts together. I highly recommend using both glue and brad nails. It'll only take a couple hours for the glue to set, enough to move on to the next step, which is cutting all these pieces down to size. The acoustic insulation comes exactly in a 4x2 size, and I didn't want to have to cut any of it down to fit, so the insulation completely dictated the size of my frame. I did add an 1/8 inch as wiggle room to both the length and the width. And when it came to the depth of the panel, I did add an extra 1/4 inch just so the insulation wouldn't be snugly up against the fabric, which might be visible in certain lighting. When assembling the panel frame, I again used both wood glue and 1 1/4 inch brad nails and let them cure overnight before moving on to the next step. This next step took quite a bit of time actually to do, which is sanding all the edges of the frame down, specifically where the fabric wraps around. Since I'll be using a thin polyester stretch fabric, I didn't want it snagging or tearing on any sharp edges. I used a 220 grit sandpaper and block and did it all by hand. I also used a wet cloth and wiped each frame down to remove all loose dust before moving on to the next step. When it came to choosing the right fabric, this part was a little bit tricky. From what I've read, you want a very loose knit fabric. Some ways to check is by bringing up the fabric to some light and making sure it's easy to see through. I ended up with this polyester stretch fabric here because it was very thin and also was more difficult to wrinkle. Now, when it came to stretching out the fabric over the frame, my method evolved as I did this for the 10 panels that I was making, and I found it to be easiest with the least chance of wrinkles by first doing one long side. On this first long side, you don't want to stretch it in any direction actually, but first try your best to just get it on the tape in its original form. After you get the whole side down, you can now staple it. I actually bought some fabric tape, which helped so much. This is to temporarily hold the fabric before the staples go in, which was an absolute game changer. If you made a slight mistake, you could retry it without having to remove any staples. Now, only after you get to the opposite side will you now want to stretch it out towards yourself only. And this side is much easier to do now that the other side is tethered down. If you have to stretch it out slightly towards the short ends as well, that's fine too, but keep this to a minimum. I found this to be the best way to do it. And as the tape keeps everything held down in place, you can now calmly staple this side down as well. And I use a circular knife to cut off any excess. The short sides are by far the easiest to do. Here, you will also stretch out firmly towards yourself only and push down where the tape is to hold it in place and staple it down and cut off any excess as well. Make sure to fold over the edges neatly to reduce any bumps and humps. This will make fitting the oak wood trim much easier. Now we can finally stuff each panel with the pre-cut acoustic insulation, and you don't want to use just regular insulation found from your local home improvement store. Those are loose and won't work well for this project. The ones specifically made for acoustic panels are rigid and won't sag over time, giving you a nice, neat, smooth, clean look. Wrapping the backside of the frame, we use the same method as the first. In fact, it's much easier to do. Again, making sure you're stapling flush and folding your fabric edges neatly. You don't want any staples protruding. They will get in your way when sliding the oak frame around. You'll need 2 pieces per panel, one for the front and one for the back. Each piece I cut at about 30 inches wide, and when purchasing the fabric, on the cardboard bolt itself of the fabric, it'll tell you the width it comes with. Make sure this is long enough for the length of your panel. For example, the fabric I used was 57 inches wide, which was plenty for a 4-foot panel. And remember, the panel does come out slightly larger than 4x2, since that's only the exact size of the cavity in which the insulation will sit. My panel's final size was 51 inches by 27. Now let's move on to making the wood oak border. I used a 3/4 inch oak plywood panel and cut it in half using a track saw first, making it into a more manageable size, and then used my table saw to cut out even strips. I would need 2 8-foot pieces per panel and ended up using a whole sheet for a total of 11 acoustic panels. I then covered up the edges of the plywood with oak edge banding, and this step is not necessary since both sides won't actually fully be visible, but you do want to stain the edges because they partially will be visible in some lighting, and if you leave them just plain wood color, it's very noticeable. I decided to edge band because I really do not like staining the unfinished edge of plywood. It tends to soak up excess stain and snag the cloth I use to wipe the stain on. And in the end, you do get a much more professional looking product. Next, I moved on to cutting those oak strips down to size. You'll want to test fit out on one of the panels first and then use that board as your template to cut the rest out. You really don't want to add any wiggle room when cutting these out. You'll want them as snug as possible when fitting them over the panels, since they will not come out flush with the fabric when installed over the panel if you do give it a little bit too much wiggle room. Next, we move on to sanding the entire surface, which used up way too much sandpaper in my opinion. The glue from the veneer edge would gum up my sandpaper. I probably went through about 3 to 4 pieces per frame. When it came to staining, I love using Osmo's products. It's just an easy way to stain, and no matter what I seem to do, I just can't mess it up. I already had some wood panels I wanted to match upstairs, and Osmo's tobacco color was virtually a perfect match. It's an oil stain used for furniture and flooring, so you know it's gonna be durable. And it's virtually impossible to get a blotchy finish in the end. You just wipe it on and wipe off any excess. And this is the same for the top coat. I used a matte clear coat also made by Osmo, and it seems like I didn't seal the container well enough from last use, and we got ourselves a nice thick layer. Luckily, I was able just to cut it out, and what we found beneath was all usable. This top coat goes on just like the stain. You can wipe it on and wipe off any excess. Usually I'll use a cordless sander with a non-abrasive white pad to apply the stain and top coat, but since I'm working with such a thin work area, the sander makes a huge mess. After letting my oak frames sit overnight, it's now time to install them. Some of the oak frames did fit a little bit more snugly than others, but I'm glad they all fit nice and tight. And I used 4 brad nails on each panel, one on each side to keep them tightly together. And I'm using the same 1 1/4 inch brad nails here as I have previously. When it came to wall hanging hardware, I found these low profile aluminum French cleats. They were easy to install, and in the end, the panels hung flush with the wall. I did account for that in the oak frame, making it slightly wider. I was super happy with how these panels turned out. I love the contrast that the wood added to the fabric, and in my opinion, that wood stain seemed to go great with all the colors I chose. Now, let's get these hung. These panels are still quite light, weighing just 13 pounds each, so it's not important to get those French cleats into a stud. The French cleats do come with all the necessary hardware, including drywall anchors. After getting all 10 panels up on the wall, there was a drastic noticeable difference in noise levels in this room. Before, conversations would seem so noisy since it's quite a small room and it mainly had bare walls. Now you can really tell the sound just gets swallowed up by the panels. This makes hearing conversations in movies so much easier and more clear. And there you have it. Hope you liked the video. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and give me a follow to see more of my DIY projects around the house.